Hello everybody, thank you so much for inviting me to participate, and I'd like this to be informal, and I know we're going to have some breakout rooms and some discussion afterwards, but please do stop me if you'd like anything clarifying or if you want to discuss a particular point. I'm really happy to do that. And I've always looked at dementia as being something that isn't just about memory. And this started from years and years ago when I started out my research career working in a memory clinic, and people who would come along to have their brain functions tested and their cognition tested would often report that they couldn't see things properly and they were having trouble with their perception. But most of the time, this wasn't really investigated, it wasn't looked at. They might be asked if they'd been to their opticians or not. And then a research paper came out categorically stating that memory really was the main thing that happened in Alzheimer's disease, but that there would be no problem at all with vision or attention because you just didn't get plaques or tangles in the areas of the brain that sort out vision and attention, if you like. And I just couldn't believe that. I thought, goodness, the brain's so interconnected, and we've got all these people in memory clinics saying, my perception, my vision isn't right, my attention isn't right. And I thought, it just can't be the case. So all of this has come from a moment of, well, I got quite cross actually. And then I changed my research from being about vision to being about vision in people living with different types of dementia. Next slide, please.
Yep. Oh, it's a bit slow.
Oh, that's okay. Would you mind putting the next bit up as well, please? I'm sorry I've got to do this, but my bandwidth is quite bad sometimes, and if I do this myself, I can disappear sometimes. So my question is, why have I spent over 20 years with colleagues studying vision and attention? Well, everybody knows, you see it on the media, we can talk about it together, that changes in memory occur in relation to different types of dementia, but especially Alzheimer's disease. It's called a canonical, it's a major presenting disorder. Next slide, please. What is interesting here is that people often go to their GP about changes in memory, but it's very rare that people will go to their GP and say, actually, I've noticed a change in my vision and my attention. And,
is she speaking now?
Sorry, somebody, could somebody mute? Sorry, just mute.
That's okay. So vision and auditory processing, vision and hearing and attention are really, really important brain functions in their own right. And if these change, if these get poorer, then it's really difficult to behave normally. And such changes can explain lots of signs and symptoms and behavioural changes in people living with dementia. Next one, please. And what's really interesting is that if your attention, your vision, your hearing isn't working properly, then actually that can detrimentally affect memory. We know that the only way that lots of information actually gets put into memory and stays in memory is because you're able to attend to it and you're able to see that information in the first place. So if your attention is bad, which something never really talks about in terms of people living with dementia, and if your vision's bad and even your hearing, then your memory isn't going to work properly either. Next slide, please. And it's become apparent over the past 20 years that different types of dementia can present with different signs and symptoms. So for example, vascular cognitive impairment, vascular dementia, the main symptom, if you dig down deep enough and don't just ask about memory, can be changes in attentional function and the speed of such processing. In a little while, I'll explain more what attention is. But speed of such processing, that's basically how fast your brain works at processing information. And if that's delayed, then what you see, what you hear, your environment has changed before you've had time to process it. So it's very difficult then to respond to it. And that can be one of the causes of some behavioural changes for people living with dementia, even in the relatively early stages. Next slide, please. So what is attention? Attention is a mechanism, it's a brain function that allows us to select and to process to a really high level the important aspects of our environments, things that we see and hear. The thing is, our brain is fantastic, but it can't process everything around it. So we have to selectively think, okay, that's what's important to me. For example, at the moment, hopefully you're attending to me primarily. Your focus is on me because I'm talking to you. And normally in healthy older adults, we're able to stop distracting irrelevant information, capturing our attention and taking our resources and our focus away from something that's not important. And our attention is very closely linked to our eyes. And next one, please, Nick. So here is my dog, Millie, and you can see that she looks to be staring at us, and that means that she's attending to us. We can tell people are interested in us, they're attending to us because their eyes, and our brain's attention system follows our gaze. Next slide, please. What I thought I'd do next, and the rest, please, Nick, is that I just show you a list of different types of vision and attention related processing that we found that are not working properly in some forms of mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's. And I'm going through these because they're quite scientific terms, if you like, and we use lots of different methodologies to measure these functions. They're not usually questionnaires, but it has an important impact on everyday behaviour. So people living in a care home, people going out and about, it can really affect how you perceive and therefore understand and therefore interact with your surroundings. Would you mind putting them all up, please, Nick, as I go through? Changes in motion processing. So it's very difficult for some people to judge how far a car is travelling when they're trying to cross the road, for example. Eye movements can be abnormal, and that means that you might not be able to follow things that are changing, things that are moving in your environment, so that information's not getting to your brain properly. The pupillary light response is something that protects our eyes from too bright a light. That sometimes isn't working. So sometimes things can look over bright to people, and it's a bit difficult to see in those circumstances. And we talk about something called early evoked potentials, and they're really measurements of the electrical activity of the brain. And there's something called automatic change detection. And this stems from when we used to be a very, very ancient kind of human, and we were watching out for wild animals in the wild and hiding in bushes. And if you heard a rustle or something captured your attention, something moved in the corner of your eye, it would capture your attention, you would orient, you would turn around to look at it. And that's still important today. It alerts us to things that in our environment that are changing. And if that's not working, again, we can be unaware of things that are changing in our environment. Visual search, if you're looking for your friend in a crowd, if they look very similar to everybody, and I've got some slides to show this later, it's very difficult to find them. If your friend is wearing a big pink fluffy hat, for example, and nobody else is, they'll pop out, you'll see them straight away. And that ability to see contrast, if you like, or to see things that pop out is quite bad sometimes in people living with Alzheimer's. Next lot, please, Nick. Shadow processing, this is really interesting because we found using lots of different types of neuroimaging and tests that people sometimes process shadows as objects, and I'm sure many of you will know about this from your experiences working with people living with dementia, that they can step over things, can step over shadows because they think there's a step there or there's a hole there or something. And normally our brain automatically, without us thinking about it, knows when something is a shadow and when it's an object. It can determine the difference between the two. We also noticed, again, I mentioned speed, how fast our brain works can be significantly reduced. And variability, most of us, if we're going through our environment looking at different things, we have a pretty constant rate of processing. We're quite good at maintaining our focus, and we're quite consistent in how good our processing is. And we find that people living with certain types of dementia and cognitive impairment, that just isn't the case anymore. Again, there's that lag of processing. We also noticed that attentional control, disengagement, orientation, and visual search, which I've just mentioned, but those things that you can decide to do. So you might be finding me a little bit boring, so you think, oh, I'm not going to listen to Andrea anymore, I'm going to look out of the window. So you can, at will, decide to look at something else and do something else. That control of your own attention, your own processing resources is really important, and that as well can decline. Our ability to focus and select what parts of our environment we look at can be abnormal. And phasic alerting is the kind of thing that you can, if you know something important's coming up, it's a little bit like anxiety, if you like. A little bit of it's quite good for you because it increases your performance. And it's called phasic alerting. And it just means that when your brain is getting ready to process something or interact with somebody, it ups its game a little bit. It becomes faster and more efficient. You can't maintain that for very long, but it does help process some quite complex information sometimes, and that can be reduced as well. Next one, please, Nick. And importantly, what a lot of people living with dementia find is that it's very difficult to inhibit irrelevant information. I know sometimes we talk about inhibitory behaviour and lack of inhibition, maybe in people living with frontotemporal dementia. There's also a much more what we call a basic brain function that we know nothing about, and that's the ability to inhibit sounds, visual changes that aren't relevant, but they can capture our attention away from what we're supposed to be concentrating on. Next slide, please. And contrast sensitivity and depth perception. You need a lot more contrast sometimes if you're living with certain types of dementia to be able to determine an object from its background, and sometimes depth perception, which is a little bit related to shadows. Different shapes, different colours, different contrasts can appear to be things at depths as well. Okay, next slide, please.
Has everybody got the mic off? But there's a bit of background for me. Is that other people, or I just wondered if was it? Oh, it's gone clear now. That's great.
Thank you. I've focused most of the time on Alzheimer's dementia, Alzheimer's disease, but also we've been looking at people living with vascular dementia and vascular cognitive impairment. And unlike people living with Alzheimer's, one of the main early signs or symptoms, if you like, is slow information processing and changes in attention. And the problem is that lots of people with vascular dementia, even especially in the very early stages, will go to their GP and say something's wrong, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And for some people, they present with perfectly normal memory according to our memory tests. And what isn't tested is perhaps their vision and attention and their speed of processing, which can be very, very, well, so can for some people be abnormal. People can really struggle with their attention. So I think one thing that I'm trying to do is raise awareness that we need to ask questions, not just related to memory and what we might call executive function types of attention, but much more basic information really about how somebody might be seeing the world and how their attention might be working. And we also need to be able to explain and ensure we understand what everybody means by attention, because a person going to a GP or living in a care home who is experiencing changes in attention might not be able to describe it as attention. So that's another area of research we're looking at. But basically we found that people living with vascular dementia tend to have very much slowed information processing, and that's related to the changes in the white matter. They're like the information motorways, if you like, of our brain that pull all the information together. Their processing can be very variable or inconsistent, which I was mentioning before. And also we find that people can have reduced attention, difficulty moving their attention from around their environment, poor visual search, poor inhibition, and reduced ability to plan ahead for processing. Usually our brain is brilliant. It can almost tell what's coming next in the visual scene and when things are moving. And we pre-process, if you like, to ready our brains and our bodies to react in advance. That's why we survived so well, because we have that ability when wild animals were chasing us. And there's also a reduction in the amount of information that can be processed at the same time. Next slide, please. So real life, how does all of this research that we've done relate to real life? Well, hopefully this research helps us to understand why people living with dementia or with cognitive impairment experience difficulty in certain environments, either at home or out and about in a care home, for example. The results can help us to understand why the propensity to falls may be greater in individuals with cognitive impairment and various types of dementia, because again, we know that being able to attend well is really important for falls. And if you're trying to walk and talk, your attention is taken away from the ability to walk, and it can lead to increased falls. We know also that attention and how fast you can process information around you is really important for driving ability. It's important for understanding things like signs and other information giving things in the environment. To be honest with you, it's important to understand things, and if signs aren't very clear, then I had a bee in my bonnet, I have to say. That's why it says toilets, because you know, just coming out of some public toilets, there's no signage for the way out. And if you can't interact with your environment properly and you can't interpret your environment, it can be really difficult. I've seen people freeze because they can't interpret their surroundings and be able to get out of a door. It affects everyday living, getting dressed, at home, buildings. It's important to take into account changes in attention, as well as things like memory when you're designing buildings and equipment and clothing for people. We've got some information to show that just a gentleman trying to put on a check shirt couldn't find the sleeves of his shirt, so couldn't put on that shirt. Yet when he was given a plain white shirt, lay down on the bed, so there's lots of contrast, he had absolutely no problem in recognizing it as a shirt and being able to put it on. You know, being able to attend and to see well and perceive well is important for general health and well-being, not forgetting also that some people living with dementia and cognitive impairment are still in work. Next slide, please. And a big long list here. It's important for behaviour. It can contribute to somebody's frailty and social isolation. We've done some work to show that, you know, if you feel you can't attend or you're losing track of things, you really can become quite socially isolated because you're embarrassed to go out and socialise, because maybe you can't quite understand what's going on. And it's not just related to memory, but you might not be perceiving things properly. Leads to social exclusion, a reduction in independence, and an increase in the need for the provision of appropriate care. And one thing is that if we understand some of these changes that are not just related to memory, then maybe we can design what we do with people and environments so we can promote the use of sometimes very well preserved other aspects of brain function and help reduce the need for care. It's also important in diagnosis and monitoring because, as I've mentioned several times, predominantly we focus on memory and what we call higher order brain functions like perception and executive function. It's rare, but it's becoming more important now that vision and hearing are tested and other brain functions as well. And we can also use training, and that's why we maximise brain functions that are preserved. And there's some evidence to show that we can even improve attention and information processing speed in somebody living with attention with the right techniques. Next slide, please. And I just want to share with you, you might already know about this, but I thought this was absolutely brilliant work by Agnes Houston. And I won't read it all out, but there are links to her presentations and her film and leaflets, because Agnes highlights something that we used to see in the memory clinic a long time ago, and that's the importance of listening to people when they're reporting symptoms that don't fit with your list of cognitive tests that you're going to give people. And she talks about sensory changes, and she quite categorically is so right when she says dementia can be more than memory. Next slide, please, Nick. And again, this is a leaflet by her, and I'd really encourage you to look at it. It's absolutely brilliant, and there's a series of films that go with it, and the links. Next slide, please. Here's a link to the booklet. Next slide, please, Nick. And I'd also like to highlight as well that the Alzheimer's Society have now produced fact sheets about changes in attention and vision and hearing, and they're really, really good, and they are based on scientific research, but they're written in a really user-friendly way. So again, I'd just like to share that with you. Next slide, please. I talked earlier about visual search and our ability to find a friend in a crowd, and how our attention and how our brain works. And if I said to you, can you find the water lily? It would be instantaneous. You don't have to search through that slide I'm showing you to find the water lily. And that's because it's such high contrast and our brain is really good at it. Next slide, please. If I asked you to find the bird, it might take you a little bit longer because it's camouflaged and it shares lots of what we call features, i.e. its colour, with its surrounding environment. And whereas lots of people living with dementia are able to do what we call the pop-out search when you see something of high contrast like the water lily, people living with dementia often will take a much longer time, if at all, to find the bird under these circumstances. So I know these are quite simplistic pictures, but if you're in a very cluttered environment and everything looks the same, it can mingle together and you might not be able to discern specific objects and find what you want to do. Next slide, please. If I asked you to find the cat, now this is a more typical kind of home scenario. The cat is actually behind the silver bin and behind, there's like a red and white spotted, yeah, there it is, there's the cat. And even if you're not living with dementia, it can be really difficult to find that. And if you are living with dementia, we found that scenes like that are very, very difficult to perceive and to find things in. And we've done some work using eye tracking and lots of other things which show that actually if you film a person with their permission in their own home, the more cluttered it is, the more difficult it is to find something and to make something like a cup of tea. Next slide, please. So onto some techniques we use. We use lots of different types of methods, qualitative and quantitative, focus groups. We ask people what they think about attention, what it means to them, what changes they might notice. We ask whether people can report changes in their attention, and yes, they can if we ask the right questions and we describe what it is. We use something called psychophysics, which is really quite a long name for saying we use lots of tests, lots of computers to look at this. We use eye tracking, and now we can use glasses just like mine with tiny cameras on to measure where people's eyes are looking, and pupillometry. There's electroencephalography, where we just stick little markers on the brain, to measure the electrical activity of the brain, because that gives us a really good indication of how vision and attention in different parts of the brain are working. And we've got some sleep work going on as well. And we use neuroimaging, MRI scanners and magnetic scanners as well, just because sometimes there are changes that we want to find out about that people can't describe to us. Next slide, please. And this is a magnetoencephalography at Kubrick at Cardiff University. And that's my mum on there, because my mum has been involved for many, many years about trying things out for us and saying, no, you can't ask a person to do that, or this doesn't work. And she's been invaluable actually in her advice about this. So I think what I'm trying to show here is that we use a really wide range of techniques to find out information, to gain evidence, so we can talk about things in an evidence-based way. Next slide, please. And we go from really the high-tech stuff, like that scanner, to much more low-tech stuff like qualitative interviews. The automatic visual change detection I showed you about, we put on a computer screen these different stimuli, and we move them, and those different white bars make the areas of the brain associated with attention and vision light up, if you like, and we can measure how, next slide please, we can measure what we call brain waveforms, activity waveforms in the brain, and we can see if the brain's acting normally to those stimuli in a person who's living with dementia compared to somebody who is not living with dementia. And we can see what functions are working and which aren't. Next slide, please. Again, eye tracking, pupillometry. That's just a picture of what you see when you wear glasses like these with the little cameras on. You get a fantastic picture of the pupil, and also you can tell around a scene. Somebody going to a supermarket, for example, you can see how well they're shopping, what they're looking at. Next slide, please. And we also use, all of them, please, Nick, thank you. We also use iPads because they're a bit cheaper than the scanner. They're a lot cheaper than the scanners, let's face it. They're a bit cheaper than computers sometimes. And you can do what we call visual search tasks here as well. You can say to somebody, this is a bit like Trails A and B, but you press the iPad screen and you say, right, can you press from 1 to 7? And that gives us an indication of somebody's behavioural reaction time, how constant those responses are. And they might have hundreds of trials of this, which only take a few minutes. And we find that some people living with dementia are very hesitant at beginning tasks as well. But if you give people enough time, then you can find out that their attention and their reaction time are actually really good. But if you only measured using one trial or a few trials, you can really underestimate the preservation of function sometimes, and we have to be aware of that as well. And we can also, that's related to test assessment anxiety, because I'm sure we all know, and some of us, I do especially, even if I go for an eye test, I get a bit anxious, and that can affect your behaviour as well, and thus how well you do or not do in such a test. I'm almost through these, sorry folks, I know it's been a whistle-stop tour, but next one please, Nick. We also, I mentioned earlier about falls, and we have I work with people in engineering at Swansea University, and we've pinched, if you like, some fantastic technology that they used to use to measure migration in birds, and they're called accelerometers. And these can measure how well you're balancing and how well you can go up a flight of stairs. And these things are so sensitive that you can tell if you've gone up 1 or 2 steps. They're so sensitive. And they can give us a lot of information about how somebody is walking, their gait, their balance and things like that. Next slide, please. And finally, I just want to really show you, we've got a new building called the Owen Institute that is funded by WEFO, Welsh Government. We can't use it yet because of COVID, but we're nearly there. But this is a specially built centre where we can mock up somebody's home, somebody's wards, care home environments, and we can monitor and do research in there. We can see how people interact, how their attention and other aspects of brain function